Hello and welcome to another painting video. In this video I'll be painting the Glottkin, probably the biggest model I've ever painted. There are so much crazy details and most of them are quite disturbing. I wanted to make sure this model looked nothing like my Great Unclean One if they were standing side by side. Variation is very important in an army. My idea behind the two skin tones is that on one hand the skin is rotting, falling to gangrene, but on the other hand the skin is also mutating due to the gifts of Nurgle. Let's begin, shall we? Let's start with by far the biggest area, which is the skin. I use an airbrush to add hopgrad hide in random patterns on the Glottkin. Of course, you can also use a brush. The areas that are still white, I shade with Druchii Violet. Don't worry if you hit the hopgrad hide parts, as this will all help in blending the two skin tones together. The Glottkin kinda looks like a Milka wrapper now. I shade the yellow-green part with Athonian Camoshade. For even more variation, I add Plaguebear flesh to random parts of the greenish skin. Now I start layering the skin. First, I dry brush Rakarth flesh on the purple skin. Again, no problem if you hit the borders of the other skin color. Next, I bring back hopgrad hide with a dry brush to the green-yellow part of the skin. Dry brushing makes the skin look a bit dusty. That's why I now go over the skin again with Rakarth flesh. This time I use a regular brush. I do the same with the previous color, hopgrad hide. Time for another wash. This time Averland Fleshshade. I focus on the areas that will have pustules, wounds, and other places which are used heavily, like the knee and the bottom part. I go over the entire model. Now to highlight. First I use a mix of Rakarth flesh and palette switch flesh. I go quite rough with my highlights to create texture on the model. Then I highlight the green-yellow skin with a mix of hopgrad hide and Kislev flesh. Next I highlight the purple part, but now with pure palette switch flesh. And finally I highlight the green-yellow skin with pure Kislev flesh. This is a good base for the Glottkin. I have some variations in the skin which I do find important on big models like these. There are tons of small details on this model which are now presented in a clearer way than before. Let's have a look at the myriad of tentacles he has growing everywhere. All the tentacles are painted with Voluptuous pink. Because this paint is slightly transparent, the underlining layer will help color the tentacle in interesting ways. Next, I shade the tentacles with Druchii Violet. I focus on the tips and water my wash down when nearing the base of the tentacle. Now I layer pink horror on the tentacles. I focus on the raised areas. The highlight is made with Emperor's Children. And a second highlight is made with a mix of Emperor's Children and palette switch flesh. Painting these tentacles already adds more variety to the model. More and more we'll be able to distinguish all the little details on this huge model. Let's paint some skulls next. There are a lot of hidden skulls on this model. I base coat these with Ushabti bone. Then I shade them with Skeleton Horde. And highlight them with Screaming Skull. There are also skulls hiding in the horns, but I'll be painting those after I do the horns. That way we don't have to work around those tiny painted objects when working on the larger horns. The Glottkin's hide is marked with all kinds of wounds. To accentuate them, I shade them with Carroburg Crimson. Then I go over the same areas with Druchii Violet. Here I try to keep the wash near the base of the wounds. Any fatty tissue that is visible is painted with Averland Sunset. Highlighted with Ushabti bone and given a shade of Seraphim Sepia. The protruding guts are base coated in Cadian Fleshtone. Then I shade them with Athonian Fleshade. I layer Kislev flesh on the raised areas. And highlight the guts with Flayed One flesh. Normally I paint my guts a little bit different, but on this model it's necessary, because painting guts in a pinkish hue would not make them stand out. There will be additional steps to the wounds and guts, but we'll get to that at the end of the video. Welcome to the most time-consuming part of painting the Glottkin. First I go over all the pustules on the green and yellow skin and paint them roughly with Kislev flesh. Then I go over the purple skin and paint the pustules with Palletwitch flesh. Now that the pustules are a lot lighter, I use Yenden yellow to add a base coat. Next I highlight the pustules with Uriel yellow. And finally I add a highlight of Screaming Skull. Phew, is that a lot of work? Oh yes. Is it worth it though? I think so. You could try a dry brushing technique here, but I don't think you'll get the same effect as I have here. Look how gross this looks. Isn't it great? There are a lot of fun little bulbs on the back here that I want to paint as eyeballs. First, I paint them with Wraithbone to get a nice white base. You could paint normal color irises like blue or brown, but I want my eyes to be demon eyes, so Evil Sun Scarlet it is. I highlight the irises with Wild Rider Red. I then paint some of the eyes, as you can see. Those eyes are now painted with Blood Angel Red. Then I paint irises in them with Uriel Yellow. Now I use Abaddon Black to dot the pupils on all the eyes. Take your time here, as you need to be a little bit accurate. To add some shading to the eyeballs, I use Basilicanum Grey. I focus on the bottom of the eye here. Finally, I add Ardcoat to make the eyeballs glossy and reflective. These eyeballs really add to the disturbing factor the Glottkin has going for him. Now I'm going to paint his grabby arm, which is called the inside of the maw. I'll be painting with Sotek green. And I shade it with Drakenhof Nightshade. Then I start layering and highlighting. First with a mix of Sotek green and Temple Guard blue. Next I use a mix of Temple Guard blue and Nurgling green. And finally a highlight of Temple Guard blue mixed with Nurgling green and a little bit of white scar. The outside of the teeth are painted with Wraithbone. Shaded with Skeleton Horde. And highlighted with Screaming Skull. Originally, I wanted the gums and the inside of the mouth to be blue, but I kinda like the idea of an eerie blue glow coming from the mouth. That's why the inside of the teeth are also blue. Gives a fun spot color on the overall model as well. The Glottkin is festooned with horns. First, I coat all of these horns with Rhinox hide. I want to start with a dark base and bring up lighter colors as I go. In order to catch any deep ridges I might have missed, I shade the horns with Nuln Oil. Now I'm going to layer on Mournfang Brown to the horns. I actually stop with my small brush and finish with a dry brush because layering that many horns like this is madness. Make sure the base coat is still showing at the bottom. Next, I dry brush Scrag Brown on the horns. I again leave room at the bottom for the previous layer to show, creating a gradient. I do the same with Deathclaw Brown, keeping closer and closer to the tip of the horns. Next, I use Ushabti Bone. Here I stay on the tips of the horns, but I do a slight dry brush over the entire horn to create an off-white highlight. The tips of the horns are dry brushed using Screaming Skull. The rotting insides of the horns are painted with a mix of Nurgle's Rot and Uriel Yellow, creating a glossy and eerie looking glow inside the horns. I highlight the various pustules in the horns with Nurgling Green. Creating a gradient on these huge horns really adds to the model. Again, there are so many details in the rotting horns, amazing. Don't forget to paint the skulls in the horns, and there is a little Nurgling hiding in one of them as well. A how to paint Nurglings link is now in the upper right corner of the screen. The huge hooves of Glotty are base coated with Incubi Darkness. Then I shade them with Nuln Oil. I layer on Cabalite Green to places where the light would hit. Finally, I highlight them with Ogryn Camo. As you can see, I used the same technique I did on the rotting horns on the inside of the hooves here as well. Now I'm going to tackle some details on the face of Glotty. First, I paint the eye with Blood Angel Red. Then I paint the bags under his eyes with Dark Reaper. His tusks and teeth are painted with Scrag Brown. I apply Deathclaw Brown to the teeth and tusks. I make sure the previous layer is still showing at the bottom. To highlight the tips, I paint Flayed One Flesh on the tusks and teeth. Finally, I add a wash of Athonian Camoshade to the teeth and the surrounding gums and lips to add some more color variation and shading. This is a face only a mother could love, or Nurgle. These steps for painting tusks are a bit too much on a small model, but a big model like this needs more color variation. Most of the model has been painted. Now we're left with some details. Let's look at the gory stuff first. The sacrificial heart I paint with Volupus Pink. Then I paint the veins with Xerius Purple. The fur, or grass, or whatever it is dry brushed with Kislev Flesh. And shaded with Athonian Camoshade. I want to give a little bit of extra attention to this strange Nurgle logo / tumor. I painted with Hoeth Blue. Then I shaded with Dragonhove Nightshade. Next I add some layers and highlights. First I bring back Hoeth Blue. Then I highlight with Verizian Grey. And finally with Blue Horror. Now I'm going all over the model to add blood for the Blood God. I use an old brush for this, and I make sure I have very little paint on the brush. That way you can create some interesting textures on the wounds and also the skin. Add more blood where applicable, or where it's just plain gross. I do the same with Nurgle's Rot. It looks great inside wounds. And with that I mean it's gross. Add it seeping out of open pustules or layer it on the skin to make it glossy and shiny. This is starting to look like one scary looking avatar of Nurgle. It's worth it to really take your time with this model and go over all the nasty bits. Really adds to hopefully people feeling sick just by looking at him. For the final details, I start with the various metal bits. I paint all of this with Iron Warriors. Then, whatever I want to be brass, I paint with Balthasar Gold. I shade all the metal and brass with Agrax Earthshade. Metal is getting a rust effect with Troll Slayer Orange. And brass is painted with Nihilak Oxide to get a verdigris effect. Finally, I randomly add Runefang Steel to the metal to create some highlights. The leather straps around the belly and leg are painted with Gore Gruntra Fur. And the ropes constricting the whip arm are painted with snakebite leather. And here we have the Glottkin in all his gory glory. Insanely detailed and disturbing, and ready to head the Maggotkin army in the glory of Nurgle. His sorcerer brother Athrak was painted the same way as my Rotbringer sorcerer. A link is in the upper right screen. His other brother Otto was painted the same way as I paint my Blight Kings. I also added that link on the screen. This model was a joy to paint. With 700 points he might not see a lot of playtime, but painting it was an experience. With this model, this also concludes my Maggotkin run I had going. They might be back in the future, as I do not have all the Maggotkin models yet, and there are some I would still like to paint. Next up, I'm going to make a start on my Cruel Boys army, starting with the Gutripas. Also check out my Instagram, where I post pictures and behind the scenes stuff. For now, ride the Glottkin, and thanks for watching.